Welcome everybody to the first applied research webinar for the Southern Ag Exchange Network. I am Dr. Andrew Spolsky. I coordinate the applied research team with a wonderful set of colleagues at universities across the Southern region. The Southern Ag Exchange Network is a USDA funded project that is focusing on farm and ranch stress and providing support for our farmers in the region. And today, Dr. Cheney Mosley, who is an assistant professor of agricultural education and assistant director of the Tennessee STEM Education Center, will be providing information on the role of agricultural educators in understanding farm stressors and suicide warning signs. So I'm very appreciative of him giving us our time today, and I'm going to turn it over to him. Thanks, y'all.
Thanks, Andy, and thank you everyone for joining. I'm excited to be here this morning. It always feels odd to say I'm excited to share what we've learned about suicide in agriculture, but it is exciting because we have some interesting things to share, and we'll talk about some future directions. Excuse me. When we see this slide, we see the title of the presentation. You registered for it, you know. School-based agricultural educators' knowledge of farm stressors and suicide warning signs. Excuse me. At the bottom, you see a list of researchers. So I'm not a lone researcher in this project. I had colleagues from across the country who supported the work. I'll just pause for a moment and let you take a look at the list of researchers in the universities represented on this project. A wealth of knowledge, skills, and expertise collaborated on this, and I want to certainly recognize my colleagues and my peers who contributed to this work. Today, I'm just the messenger. And perhaps you see the names of someone that you know or that you recognize. If so, feel free to shoot them a message and say, hey, I attended this webinar today. Great work on that research project. I'll also tell you that this was one part of three specific components of this research, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. So first, an introduction. We know or may not come as a surprise that there's a need for identifying and creating sustainable practices in rural areas to identify and support those in practice. And this is due to limited access to health care and also a stigma associated with mental health. When I talk about this, I should let you know that I grew up in a rural area here in Tennessee, very small town. The school I attended was public school, but grades K through 12 in the same building. Maybe not as small as some of you, but there were only 32 folks in my graduating high school class. So the topic of mental health in rural areas is very close to my heart. What I know from growing up in a rural area and also having taught in rural Georgia for 5 years is there is a stigma associated with mental health, especially when we consider farmers and ranchers and others who work in the agriculture industry in general, who often emerge as leaders in their communities. Maybe they serve as pastors or deacons or elders or lay leaders in their churches or other faith-based organizations. Perhaps they sit on boards of directors for local agricultural organizations such as the Farm Bureau or the Beef Cattlemen's Association. And it may be that they just frequent the local diner and drink coffee every morning from 7 to 7:30 with their colleagues. Because of this, these individuals are often seen as leaders who are supposed to be strong. They can handle anything because they are agriculturists, and regardless of the challenges, they can overcome. But when these individuals experience a mental health crisis, it can be difficult for them to acknowledge and talk about this and then seek help. With regard to school-based agricultural education teachers, when I use that term, I'm talking about formal teachers in a middle or high school setting who are providing agricultural education instruction. They frequently reside in rural communities. Not all, but many do. And in addition to teaching middle or high school agricultural education, They also identify as farmers themselves, some farming part-time, some farming near full-time, many coming from farm families. If you're not familiar with school-based agricultural education, it is often associated with an organization that many refer to as the Future Farmers of America. The official name is the National FFA organization. And youth in these organizations are often very involved in the community with community service activities or service learning projects. They engage with fundraising activities through selling plants from a local greenhouse or a variety of activities. But in rural areas, and I experienced this in Georgia, many members of the community reach out to the agriculture teacher with questions for which they may not have answers. I recall a time that my phone rang early one morning and I stopped to answer, and a member of our community said, I just hit a wild boar. There were piglets. I have 3 of them. I'm going to raise them. What should I do? You should probably not raise them. Or frequently, members of our community would bring leaves in from their trees and ask me to identify what was wrong with their tree and how to fix it. Well, I'm neither an animal scientist nor a dendrologist, but because I was the agriculture teacher, I was seen as an expert in all things agriculture, whether it be true or not. And as such, I became an unofficial leader in the community and became familiar with many members of the community. Because of this, I and other agriculture teachers, especially those in rural areas, are and are well positioned to recognize folks who are struggling, and they're also positioned to respond when they identify someone in crisis. And because of this, I believe the research team believes that agricultural education teachers can help mitigate negative associations related to mental health by creating a conversation in their communities, both with their students and with the families they serve, and also community members. And because of that, this multi-state research team was formed to investigate school-based agricultural education teachers. And this project is supported by the USDA, National Institute of Food and Agriculture, Farm and Ranch Stress Assistance Network. So let's get into the meat of this. We're maybe familiar that a 2016 CDC report highlighted the rates of suicide in the agricultural community being twice that of the general population. I believe there were some inaccuracies in that data, but nonetheless, it did bring to light that the struggles often associated with living and residing in a rural area and working in agriculture. In 2020, a literature review about this topic was conducted, and there was a need that was identified, which was more science or more investigations where suicide was the primary focus of the study. And that's what we aim to do here within the context of agricultural education. We found that there had only been one prior study from 2020 that actually focused on agricultural education teachers. And I'm so happy that Dell Layfield was one of the authors of that previous study from Clemson University, was happy to and willing to join our research team. So the purpose of our study of this specific presentation was to explore the awareness of farm stressors and suicide warning signs of school-based agricultural education teachers in the southern region of the United States. Later on in the presentation, I'll share a map of the southern region, and this is as defined by USDA NEFA for the purpose of this grant project. I should also tell you that in addition to identifying recognition or awareness of farm stressors and warning signs, we had 2 other aspects of our study that we're still digging into the data. One of those investigated or looked at ag teachers' exposure to suicide, both professional with colleagues or with students or with members of the community, and personal with family members as well. We also investigated the professional development needs of school-based agricultural education teachers. And the purpose of this, as Andy hinted at early on, was applied research. Our goal is to conduct this research and then take the findings and actually apply them so that we can better position ag teachers for the purposes that we've just talked about, to recognize and respond to those in crisis in their communities. So 2 research objectives for this specific project were to describe the Southern Region ag teachers' knowledge of farm stressors and to assess their knowledge of suicide warning signs. The theory that we used was the interpersonal theory of suicidal behavior. Now, if you focus on this image on the screen, you see an overlap in this Venn diagram where thwarted belongingness, characterized by the feeling that I'm alone, as well as perceived burdensome, which is characterized by this feeling of I'm a burden to others. When those two aspects overlapped, that is when that's the most dangerous suicidal desire. You see that represented by this image here. Our thought was, if we can recognize when folks feel like they are alone and feel like they are a burden, they may have a desire for suicide, and then we can, take action for early intervention. If we know that folks also have the capability for suicide, and you see that small, very dark triangular shape in the middle of that Venn diagram, then we know that there's an increased likelihood for a suicidal attempt. In rural and agricultural communities, the capability for suicide is often heightened due to access to things due to access to lethal means, such as chemicals that might be poisonous, farm machinery that could be quite dangerous, or firearms, shotguns, rifles, and things like that. So we thought this theory was very appropriate to ground our study in. Here on the right, you see the map of the area that we were researching. Again, we characterize this as the southern region of the United States. There are 13 states and 2 territories, the U.S. Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico. So that was sort of the focus. We did have 1 faculty researcher from every state represented here on this map, as well as a faculty researcher from Puerto Rico. And though we did not have a researcher from the U.S. Virgin Islands, there was an agricultural education teacher from the U.S. Virgin Islands who partnered with us to help distribute the survey to ag teachers in that territory, and we were so appreciative of that. The research team designed the survey. We looked at previous instruments. We looked at literature related to things that contribute to farm stress. We looked at literature around suicide warning signs. And it's possible, it's likely that some of these things were left off, but we worked to identify those that we saw repeated in literature multiple times. And we conducted a pilot test for reliability of the instrument that we used. We ended up with 793 usable responses, which is a very large response rate. We're happy about that. I should tell you that we conducted a census study. We did not do a randomized sample. We felt a census would be most appropriate for many reasons. As we only identified 1 prior study, this area of research is still quite novel, and therefore we felt it was important to gain as many responses as possible. Also, through census, we are able to generalize to the entire population, and we're happy about that as well. Our response rate, and I'm not going to share that, but it was higher in some states and lower in others. So I fear that if we had conducted maybe a random sampling, that we would not have had as great participation. You see a bullet point, a sub point under that second bullet point. And we'll circle back to this later on when we discuss findings and conclusions and recommendations. But it's important to point out that 21% of our would-be participants were filtered out due to previous suicidal ideation. Let me explain that a little bit. Our survey was electronic, and when an agriculture teacher clicked the link to participate in the survey, they were presented with 2 questions. The first was, have you ever felt so isolated that you contemplated suicide? If they answered yes, they were filtered out from participating in the study and taken to a resource page with information where they could seek help if they felt that again. If they answered no, they were taken to a second question, which asked, have you ever felt so depressed that you've contemplated suicide? And there again, if they answered yes to that question, they were filtered out, not allowed to participate, and taken to a page with resources. Do the math, folks. 21% represents more than 200 agriculture teachers. It's not quite a quarter or 25% of the population, but it was very close. This was not something that as agricultural education researchers, as all of us having previously taught middle or high school agriculture, we did not anticipate such a high number of our colleagues who are currently teaching having experienced feelings of isolation or depression such that they contemplated suicide. So this wasn't a finding from the results of the study. This was a finding simply from those who attempted to participate, and a very high number. We didn't anticipate that. Further, our instrument asked about demographic characteristics and the awareness of farm stressors and suicide warning signs. So let's take a look at the demographics. I will not talk you through each of these images, but I will allow you a minute or two to peruse the demographics: gender, age, disability, years of teaching experience, race, ethnicity, and community size. As you're looking, I will just do a few highlights. The majority of the participants were females without a disability between the ages of 26 and 35 with 1 to 10 years of teaching experience, white, most coming from a rural area, a small city or a town. So we'll jump to the findings, and then I hope that we can engage in conversation. I'm not sure the settings of this. I don't know if we will be able to ask questions by chat or if we'll be allowed to unmute, but I look forward to conversation. So our objective one was to describe the awareness of farm stressors for school-based agricultural education teachers. So we used a 3-point Likert type scale, with 1 being not a farm stressor and 3 being definitely a farm stressor. We presented all of the farm stressors, and these were the top 5 farm stressors that were recognized by school-based ag teachers: high debt load, immense debt load, not enough money for day-to-day expenses, not enough cash or capital for unexpected problems, and a concern about the future of the farm. I'll tell you one of the most infrequently recognized farm stressors was changes in the season, and we found that interesting. And I'll talk about that a little bit more as we move to the next slide. But the overall mean for this was for this scale was 2.46, and that's out of 3. Generally speaking, ag teachers were able to recognize a little more than half of the things that stress farmers out. So then we move on to objective 2, which was to assess school-based ag teachers' awareness of suicide warning signs. Same scale: 1, not a warning sign; 3, definitely a warning sign; 2, I'm not sure, it might be a warning sign. And we see here the top 5 warning signs that were recognized by ag teachers: no reason for living and no sense of purpose in life, feeling trapped, like there's no way out, withdrawing or from friends, family, or society, feeling of hopelessness, or getting plans in order for their end of life. A warning sign that was not recognized was a change in seasonal workload. And I say not recognized, it was at the bottom of the what ag teachers did recognize as a warning sign. And we think about changes in season being a stressor for farms, and I think that makes sense, right? When spring hits and farmers are planting crops, or crops are growing rather, and then a frost comes through, well, and it kills a crop, that's a seasonal change, right? Or in the summer there's a drought and there's a struggle with crops and livestock, that's a seasonal change. Or in the winter, there's a big freeze and it snows and there's no water, the water freezes and livestock may not have access to water, for example. That's a farm stressor. Or a hurricane hits, or a tornado comes through, or all sorts. We have these seasons, and I think those are easy to understand. But when we think about agriculture teachers and we think about changes in seasonal workload, the discussions that we had around this where that as a teacher, August is always exciting because school begins. May is always exciting because school ends and the students are going on for their summer break. But this aspect of the National FFA organization, Ag Teacher Service FFA advisors, and they often lead or coach their students through a variety of competitive teams or competitive events. Just last week, I was in Indianapolis, Indiana, with roughly 60,000 other agriculture teachers and high school students for the National FFA convention. But there are things that we refer to in Ag Ed as competition season, where these competitions are stacked on top of each other, one after another, where we're spending hours and hours after school working with our students, training and preparing them for competitions. And then comes award season, where we are spending hours after hours with our students applying for awards so that they can be recognized for their accomplishments in agricultural education. Those aspects of the work of an ag teacher characterize seasonal changes in the workload. In other words, workload may increase in some seasons. And when that happens, if we recognize that the workload is increasing, that also increases the potential for stress, which can also lead to depression. So those are just some interesting things to think about from a perspective of agricultural education. So what we know is that prevention efforts that target thwarted belongingness, that's where those feel like they don't belong, like they're isolated, and efforts that target that perceived burdensome, that feeling of I'm a burden to others, can be effective. But the interventions that address these feelings, we know that interventions that address these feelings should produce the best outcomes. The challenge is if we are unable to recognize these feelings when they occur, we're also then unable to respond. So while we know the top 5, and that's what we've talked about today, farm stressors or warning signs of suicide that ag teachers do recognize, we also have the ability now to generalize that ag teachers may not recognize some of the other things that stress farmers out, and some of the things that that may be a potential warning sign for suicidal ideation. That's important. You see here that we recommend training agricultural education teachers on farm stressors and suicide in order to better equip them to recognize warning signs and intervene, not only with their students and not only with their colleagues, but also with members of the community. I mentioned that these teachers are positioned well to recognize. Perhaps a student comes in and mentions something that's happening in their home, or mentions a comment that their parent or their guardian or a family member has said. And an agriculture teacher might tune in and think, I wonder what's going on. I realize that on their farm, they just experienced this trouble. I should check in with that family to make sure they're okay. Let me make note of that, right? So this is quite helpful. So therefore, we recommend that suicide-related professional development be offered where ag teachers convene. I mentioned the National FFA convention, but every state association of FFA holds a convention annually, so maybe there's an opportunity there. Also, agricultural educator professional development conferences. In December, I'll be attending the National Association of Agricultural Education Conference in Las Vegas, Nevada. And there, our research team will be presenting a series of workshops targeted towards agriculture teachers to address some of the deficiencies that we recognized or that we learned about through this study. And we're pretty excited about that. Most states have a professional association for their ag teachers. This past summer, I was able to present a session here in Tennessee to our ag teachers conference. We also hope that agricultural education faculty such as myself will begin talking about these things in our classes and equipping our future teachers with this information. So a lot of opportunities there. Here are references that were mentioned throughout the study. And with 5 minutes to go, I will, I see the Q&A is up, so I will begin clicking on the Q&A and asking and attempting to answer some of these questions. If you didn't see that, Emily said, please use the question and answer to submit questions, and we'll respond at the end. And now I see 2 coming up, so here we go. Marcia, you said, how many school-based agricultural education teachers had QPR training? So I do not have the answer to that. That's an excellent question. I don't have that yet. I will tell you that when we investigated the professional development needs of agriculture teachers, one of the questions that we asked, and this was all self-report, was one, have you attended or participated in suicide-related training before? If the answer was yes, they were then taken to which of the following have you participated in, and QPR was one of the options. So stand by, to be continued. The answer to your question will be forthcoming so that we can hopefully characterize a certain percentage. I will tell you that over this past summer, I was able to train 14 teachers in QPR here in Tennessee. An anonymous attendee asked, were the demographics collected prior to the suicidal ideation screening? Excellent question. No, they were not. Because the demographics were part of our survey, we were unable to assess the demographics of those who were filtered out. That's it. I love that question because an additional, I'll talk about demographics briefly. And I presented at a conference at the beginning of October. It's the Cultivating Change Summit, which targets an audience of LGBTQI plus and allies working in and around agriculture. It shared our research there. There are many ag teachers who fall into or identify with that demographic as well. One of our, a few missed opportunities. We did not ask for sexual orientation, and we should have, because we know that those who are members of the LGBTQI plus demographic are at a higher risk for suicide. We also did not ask for religious affiliation, and we feel that we should have, and in future studies, that's something that we would also recommend, because we wonder, is there an association with religious perspectives? I'll give you a preview. When we asked about professional development needs, there was an open-ended response question that said, what are you most concerned about with regard to addressing thoughts or concerns about suicide? And multiple folks said, responded with something along the lines of not being empathetic, because finding it difficult to empathize with folks because I don't understand where that comes from, or I believe that that suicide is selfish, and so I don't know that I could empathize. And as we reviewed that, we questioned, might some of that be related to religious perspectives, beliefs, or upbringing? So we wish we had asked that question as well. The survey participants, Kenneth, were recruited by using state agricultural education listservs. So that was the value of having an ag educator from each state represented. They were able to send the survey out or recruit participants that way. And that one ag teacher in the US Virgin Islands. And another question, as we know, ag ed as a field is extremely stressful at this time. This must be coming from an ag teacher. Yes, it is. In rural Title I schools, it's even higher. For those who are not familiar with Title I, I believe, if I'm going from memory, Title I schools are characterized as schools where 70% or greater of the student population live in economically or come from economically disadvantaged youth. Do you expect the numbers in ag teachers were specific to ag stress or overall stress due to the state of the education as a career? That's a great question, because when we ask that, it's not just about agricultural education, it's education in general. It is quite possible that we collected data earlier this year. Actually, and we launched this study in January to collect the data coming out of a lot of remote learning, still a lot of stress associated with that. So the answer is I don't know. What I will also tell you is that we asked participants to identify if they were interested or willing to participate in future studies, and if so, to provide an email address, because other than that, the responses were anonymous, and we had a pretty significant number of folks who said, yeah, I would like to learn more. So this is an area that we could certainly research further. I'm watching the time and I don't see any additional questions. It is 10:30. Which resources did you refer persons screened out via questions 1 and 2? I'll try to answer that briefly. We, of course, referred them to the National Suicide Hotline. We provided access to resources, the Trevor Project, if they were working with LGBTQI plus youth. And off the top of my head, I forget the others. That's an excellent question that I should have at the tip of my tongue. I should probably begin putting those on a slide as well. Sorry about that. For the sake of time, it is 10:30 and we've reached that time. Feel free, I didn't put my email address, but feel free to Google my name, Cheney Mosley, Middle Tennessee State University, and you'll find my email address. Feel free to reach out with an answer, or any of the members of the research team that you see here. And yeah, with that, I'll say thank you for attending this webinar, and hopefully we will have a few more webinars related to additional research coming forward. Oh, thank you. There's the my email address has been put up in the Q&A, so if you'd like to copy that and reach out for additional information, feel free to do so. I appreciate your time this morning. Thank you.
Well, thanks everybody for your attendance. Thank you so much, Dr. Cheney Mosley, for sharing this information with us. This was incredibly important to understand how agricultural educators perceive farm stress and their role in being able to support mediating it. Please, as Dr. Mosley said, if y'all have follow-up questions, his email is in the chat. And if you have any questions for SAGE overall, please reach out to us. And we will be reaching out to y'all in the future with further webinars, fact sheets, briefs, etc., as they become available. Y'all all have a wonderful rest of your week. Thank you so much.